Hi, everybody. It is Wednesday, May 7th, and we're doing a little midweek Karen Reed retrial check-in with our legal analyst, Katherine Loftus. Hi, Katherine.
Hi, nice to see you.
You too. Okay, so I want to start with how today ended. So it's Wednesday. It was a long day of testimony, mostly expert testimony. But I want to tell you, I don't even know if we've gotten to talk about this yet. Karen Reed did just talk to reporters outside court, and the
Okay.
last thing she said was their case is almost over. So she was saying you'll see something soon. But
Hmm.
she insinuated that the prosecution's case might be almost over. So I'm curious your thoughts on that, given that we haven't heard from people who are pretty big witnesses yet during the first trial.
I think it's hard for me to find that, persuasive one way or the other because respectfully, Karen Reed doesn't know what the Commonwealth intends to present. And as we have seen, there's witnesses that have already been called that maybe we didn't expect. There have been some witnesses that we have. So I don't know that just by the order in which Attorney Brennan is presenting the case is indicative of whether his case as a whole is closer to the end. I think there's a fair amount of witnesses that need to be presented from the Commonwealth's perspective. To sort of wrap it up, their job is to prove the elements of the charges that have been brought against Karen Reed. And so I think they're going to be as thorough as they feel they need to be, while at the same time, not submitting witnesses that are essentially duplicative testimony or don't add anything to the case. So, I would say maybe he's probably halfway through it, or no, if by my estimation of the pace that we've been moving along so far. So I don't know maybe she has some inside scoop on the Commonwealth's, perspective, but.
Well, let me just for our viewers so they understand, there's a gag order on the lawyers on both sides in this case. So we don't get to speak with the lawyers anymore or they don't get to speak to us rather, in order to know what's coming. And so Karen Reed is really the only person who can say anything, who's
That's
directly.
right. That's
That's
right.
right.
Just one more thing about this case that's it's sort of the norms are flipped, because normally you would never be hearing from, a second degree murder defendant instead of the attorneys, so.
Right. I am curious though. I know you say it's a big if, but if she's right, what is there a world in which the prosecution doesn't call like Proctor or Brian Higgins or Brian Albert?
Well, I think someone from the house likely has to be called, one of the homeowners. So there has to be Brian or Nicole Albert. In theory, both of them are going to give nearly, identical testimony. Aside from, the only testimony that could come from Brian Albert or Brian Higgins would be relative to earlier in the day, their drive back from, I think it was in New York, they were for a officer's funeral. But you do want somebody to substantiate what the police are saying and what Jen McCabe is saying, and that is that somebody went into the house. So you need probably one of those. You don't need both. You might call both. And in theory, the Commonwealth does not need Brian Higgins to prove their case in any way. So that strategically it would be interesting if they just left him off completely, because he does not. You have to think about. When the prosecutor looks at the case, they think about, who do I need to prove the charges that we have before us? And all really Brian Higgins does, again, is present some really duplicative testimony of what Brian Albert would say or Jen McCabe about the bar. There's not really anything new outside of what was presented in defense of sort of the pointing of the finger at him as a third party. So there is a possibility that Brennan doesn't even really give them the fodder to be able to cross-examine someone like Brian Higgins. And then the question then becomes, does the defense call him on direct in their own case in chief?
What about the text messages though? I was curious, like, what do you think the Commonwealth used those for during the last trial? Was that a motive thing, the flirty text between Higgins and Karen Reed?
Yeah, I think there was a lot of information that was presented last time that was, the goal of it was sort of to present this picture of what John and Karen's relationship really was, the Aruba witnesses and the fighting, the allegations of cheating and back and forth. And then, this flirty, one kiss between Brian Higgins, Karen Reed, sort of just presenting that it isn't, they might look like they're having fun on Friday on camera at the waterfall and CF McCarthy's, but look at what the text messages say. Look what was happening behind the scenes. But overall, I don't know what it actually does for the Commonwealth's case. I don't think that, even though she's still charged with second-degree murder, it's hard for me to believe that anybody at this point thinks that that's a realistic outcome. And so it certainly doesn't go to the manslaughter. So if the manslaughter is the main charge that you think you can potentially convict her on as the Commonwealth, Brian Higgins and really the text messages with Karen Reed ultimately aren't really relevant. They're more so relevant to the defense's theory of the case than they are to the Commonwealth's.
And Proctor, I mean, his name has been brought up so many times. So if the Commonwealth doesn't call him, the defense would have to. What do you think is the better strategy there for either side?
The only reason I say that I think the Commonwealth has to call him is because, unlike some other witnesses, maybe like a Brian Higgins or Brian Albert, and if Nicole was called, that the defense might hesitate about calling them in their own case in chief. Proctor is such an integral part of really what the defense theory is, and ultimately what goes to the Bowden defense, which is the police errors, omissions of it, and just the way everything that has come out from him about how he's spoken about her. So if the Commonwealth doesn't call Michael Proctor, I think it really dings at the credibility, because you look like you're full on trying to avoid it when obviously everybody is aware of Michael Proctor and there's something going on with Michael Proctor and the fingers are pointing at him. So if you don't call him at all, I think it looks to the jury like you're trying to hide the ball.
Okay, I want to move on to the rest of today. It was a long day, a lot of legal stuff versus just new evidence. But Jessica Hyde, who's an independent digital forensics expert, spent most of the day on the stand. She again was talking about Jen McCabe's alleged 2:27 or 6:23 a.m. Google search of how long to die in the cold. I want to ask you about the jury. I know that I'm in there seeing the jury, but today, for the first time, I noticed some jurors yawning. I noticed some jurors starting to rub their eyes. How, as a lawyer, do you present this complicated, granular cell phone data that is over most of our heads to a jury of lay people?
It's really difficult, and it's always difficult, and it's never, in an ideal world, you would have everybody's attention when it comes to this kind of stuff, because ultimately the expert opinions often are some of the most important pieces of, testimony that come in. But it's so dry that even when somebody is paying attention, it's, most of our brains aren't really able to process what they're talking about, if we're being totally honest, right? We're sort of taking bits and pieces and the rest of it. So when you kind of stop understanding as the listener, it's easier to zone out, in the difficult part is, and it happened with both Attorney Brennan and Attorney Alessi, because the substance of the testimony is the same, right? It's not like Brennan can, switch it in a way that makes it, more easily presentable. But I do think that this witness in particular, out of, probably, out of all the expert witnesses I've seen testify, in different cases, she's very much, she's sort of teaches while she's testifying, which, she obviously teaches cases, teaches classes about this stuff, which is what she talked about on direct. But so I think she herself is a little bit easier to understand than some of the other experts, because she's explaining exactly what it means. She's sort of helping the lawyers along the way. But even with a good witness like Jessica Hyde, and when I say good, I just mean, likable, understandable. It's technical stuff, and you're never going to keep the jury's attention. No matter how important the evidence is, it's very difficult as an attorney to, keep everybody paying attention for hours at a time, really.
Yeah. I want to ask you about the witness at the beginning of the day. He was on the stand for a very short time, Connor Keefe, a state trooper. But in particular, what I want to ask you about is he's the person, this didn't happen with him last trial, but he showed the jury John O'Keefe's sneaker that was found at the scene and a few pieces of taillight, physically out of the evidence bag, showed it to them. What is the importance, or is there any importance, to showing them that physical evidence with someone on the stand versus the pictures of it?
Well, it just gives everybody a feeling that this is real, right? That this is this is what happened. Then they'll, at some point, I assume, they'll see his sweater and his, any clothes that were on him and the blood that was on him. So, it's sometimes it's easy as the jury sort of to forget that, we're hearing about things and we're seeing these pictures up on a big board. But, when you see one lone sneaker, it humanizes the process that you're going through. So you always want to bring it back to, there's real people under this case,
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit for this last question.
Okay.
Tell you everybody, there's been a long list this week already. So I'm going to tell you everybody who's testified this week. And I want you to tell me who you think was the best witness for the prosecution and the best witness for the defense this week. Do you think you can do that?
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. So this week we had the Hannah Knowles, the State Police Crime Lab chemist, Ryan Nagel, Heather Maxon, Sarah Levinson, Katie McLaughlin, Canton Police Paul Gallagher, the meteorologist Robert Gilman, Canton Police Charles Ray, CERT team guy Lieutenant Kevin O'Hara, and then the two witnesses today.
I would say I think by far the best witness for the Commonwealth was Lieutenant O'Hara. He presents as just this, it really presents as somebody who's not, an interested party in any of this, that he was just called to the scene. And he is, I think he was good as a witness, both for the Commonwealth, but also the substance in which he was testifying to really is probably one of the more pivotal witnesses about whether the framing of Karen Read via the planting of the evidence theory is plausible or not. Like he presented a timeline for the Commonwealth that, if presented to the jury, as a whole, would really eliminate the possibility that Michael Proctor could have planted it. So I think he was the best for the Commonwealth. I would say that probably the best for the defense was Lieutenant Gallagher, because as much as he, I think, presented, as a likable witness, and he seemed to be credible in the way that he was answering the questions honestly, but he clearly admitted to lots of things that were missed. So, in addition to the solar cups and the leaf blower, the paper bags, not asking for the Ring camera across the street, the securing of the bags, the fact that they're, on the floor in the Sally port at some point, in the transport. So they were able to poke a lot of holes, and he was the lead supervisor at the time from the Camp Police. Even if they were only on the case for a couple of hours before being recused, I think that they were able to poke the most holes in Gallagher's testimony. So I think he was probably the best for the defense, and O'Hara the best for the Commonwealth.
Thank you. That is all I have for today.
Thank you.
For everybody watching, we'll be back on Friday with our longer full podcast of the week.